watching in the battle, yeah. Say what you want about me, yeah, but I'm a living in the green world, and I need the air to breathe. Some will say you gotta get your kicks by removing love from a natural chip. But metal will rust and money will burn, yeah. And on the final page I ask, were you living in the green world? And did you give some in return?
For all practical purposes, the Forest Service and the BLM are pretty much the same. They have to apply by the Endangered Species Act. They have to go through the NEPA process and a lot of other stuff we'll get into later. But there are subtle differences, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. So just keep that in mind, that we are at the Bureau of Land Management today and not with the National Forest Service. So what BARC does, I guess our work, I would view it as twofold. And one is educational, which is what we're out here doing today. We do these kind of hikes. A lot of you have probably seen the website, which has 50-some different timber sales going on in Mount Hood National Forest and Salem Bureau of Land Management. So we provide all that information to the public. We table at various events. We bring student groups out to visit this forest. You know, anything we can really to get the public involved in monitoring, looking after their public land. And the second aspect of what we do is ground truthing. I know a lot of people express interest in what that is, and we'll talk about that as well today. But that's a big aspect of what we do, and that's kind of going out and looking at the timber sales themselves and just seeing what we feel about it, and just going out there and getting a sense of place is how I like to think of it. You know, just going out there and imagining it all cut down and just letting that inspire you and acting from that. So, you know, we go out, we visit the timber sales. When we print out these long, boring government documents, we actually read them, and we see if that information that they're providing actually meshes with what we see on the ground. And then we write comment letters to the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management to, you know, express our feelings on it. We try to get the public involved in that as well. And so we kind of stopped up at the Portland Women's Forum, and we saw kind of a big picture of what's a watershed, major stream, and all the little tributaries that go into it. And so this is kind of a small picture, kind of a microcosm of what we might see in the future. And I just kind of want us to keep this in mind as we see other spots where this can be especially, or even more egregious than here. But as you can see here, we have this drainage ditch going down the side of the road, and we have all this water just kind of starting to fan out here. It's running right down through here, and it's going right into the creek. And this is just generally not a good thing. We haven't had much rains lately, but when the rains get going, this will get flowing relatively quickly. And as this water is traveling across the surface of the road, it's going to pick up tons and tons of sediment, and it's going to dump it right into that stream. And like Amy said earlier, this watershed provides water to the community of Corbett. So sediment is not a good thing. No one likes to eat dirt or drink dirt in their water. So, yeah, not good. And we'll see kind of more examples of this as we go. This is just kind of a small version of what's to come.
What is that little sandbag or whatever there?
This is what they're doing to try and prevent sediment from going in. They're just dropping, there's a sandbag here.
High tech.
There used to be a couple of them more up there. But yeah, they're not really doing this purpose. The water's quite fanned out through here, and it's all just kind of going around it.
Yeah.
Water wants to go downhill, and you know, it's going to find its way. I don't think a little sandbag is going to help too much. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. So anyone have any ideas about why else roads can be bad to the area?
Trucks can drive on them
Yeah.
and come get logs.
And trucks can drive on them and come get logs. Yeah.
Fragments habitat.
Fragments habitat. Yeah, it prevents critters. Some critters just won't cross the road. And so if you have a little road that's fenced in like this, a little, you know, some small critters, they're trapped there. That's where their home's going to be. Anyone know any other reasons? Sediment?
Also erosion.
Erosion?
Especially on roads where you have really steep slope, like not, especially on the roads that we saw coming in, some of those steeper ones, if those aren't maintained, then you get kind of like a gradation on the side, and that breaking off and just allowing just kind of more dirt and sediment to kind of go into the watershed system.
Yeah, absolutely.
The stream crossings, too.
Yeah.
This is actually this is a decent culvert situation, except that you've got pooling happening here because the culvert isn't big enough for the stream to go through. So potentially the temperature of the stream is rising right there and changing the habitat. And if you go on the other side, it's a pretty high velocity. The rest of the stream isn't moving that fast, but if you see how fast it's coming out of the culvert, we're definitely making a pretty big impact on the way that the stream looks because of this road. But this is actually not a bad culvert.
Yeah.
There's many that are much worse.
And this doesn't exemplify it, but another thing with culverts is, especially with the smaller culverts, a lot of times they'll get plugged up completely so water can't go through it. Then the water will rise and it'll just go completely over the top of the road. And then it's going to carry massive amounts of sediment with it. And if we get enough, when there's like peak flows, when we get a lot of rain and the water's really coming down, or worse yet, if you get a bunch of snow on the ground and you get a warm day when the rain comes down, and you'll just bring massive amounts of water down, and that's when you get landslides, and that's how you get sides of roads just get blown out, because the water's not draining through the culvert, and you get enough force of water, it'll just push the road right through it. So roads are not good. In this watershed, there's 3.7 miles of road per square mile, which is, you know, really high. Just think of a square mile and how many miles of road that is. It's almost like 4 miles going through it, one every quarter mile. Yeah.
What's the alternative to roads?
What's the alternative to roads?
Yeah, no roads.
No roads. Yeah.
Well, I think it's good to remember that there's over 4,000 miles of roads in Mountain Hood National Forest. Most of those are logging roads. Those are not roads that are leading to prime recreation sites, or some of them are, or getting across the forest. Most of those roads are built for logging. And when the logging ends, the maintenance priority goes down, and then the road starts to fall apart, and that's when you start to see culverts getting plugged, roads falling apart. So I think it's a pretty hard issue, and maybe at some point we'll talk about the upcoming travel plan stuff that Bart's working on. But it's not so much like road or no road, especially now because the cost of decommissioning roads is very, very high. That's a very resource-intensive thing to do. But there's not really an option other than spending lots of money maintaining them, because the maintenance is really important. And with that many miles of roads, it's incredibly expensive for the Forest Service and the BLM to be keeping those roads up. So we want to see no more roads being built, because they can't afford to keep them up, and they can't afford to get rid of them when they're done with them.
And we'll see a lot where they'll build a proposal and they'll call them temporary roads, which they're roads they build to get to the units themselves. And then they say they'll tear them down after the logging operation's done. But the Forest Service loses money all the time, and the BLM as well. They build the roads, they get the timber out, and then it's like, we don't have enough money to decommission that road now, and so the road stays.
What's the process of decommissioning?
Well, there's different ways they can do that. There's road obliteration, which is you just go through and you just tear up the road, And that kind of loosens the soil, because another thing with roads is it compacts the soil quite a bit. It takes years and years for plants to get their roots in there. So you can do that to kind of expedite that process. Another thing they'll do is they'll just put up a gate that at least prevents people from getting up into those areas. Another thing, I think it's called what's the other one?
Berms.
Yeah, they'll build a berm, which is basically like a huge pit and mound on one side, just, again, to prevent traffic to go in there.
It's a little really fun for OHVers to go on those.
Yeah.
A lot of times, like after the logging roads have actually been made for the logging, after that, when there's no one else using it, it's prime territory for OHV use. OHV use is really detrimental to water quality because you have these small units that are able to go all over and tear up that much more sediment, that much more vegetation. In terms of habitat fragmentation, that's really detrimental because the animals are scared off by the noisy two-stroke engines.
There is a disease, a wicked proportion, love of money and gold. Its cure will never be had. This is what I've been told. This is what I've been told. You'll never be so. Peas they love and distract. Mine will never be grown. Thinking all that is sad. This is what I've been.
So we've made it. If you guys have the maps, we are basically where the roads just split. We're right at the get my directions straight. The southwest corner of Unit 3, or it's Section 3. We don't know exactly where the sections start. At this point in time, the unit hasn't been flagged. So at some point in time, they'll put flags where they'll mark the parameter of the unit, so we know exactly when we're inside or outside of the unit.
What point of time do they do that, Grady?
The BLM is not specific. With the Mount Hood National Forest, they'll have it done usually by the time that the environmental assessment comes out. With the BLM, they said that they didn't really have a set guidelines. They try to have it by the time they reach their decision rationale.
It's pretty hard to be able to come out and see what they're going to do if we don't know where they're going to do it.
That's a really good thing. Yeah.
So where are we in the process? I know that they have a process.
Okay. So we're at, first we're at Gordon Creek. Gordon Creek unit. This timber sale this proposal is 930 acres, and it's all thinning. So we don't know exactly what that means by thinning because they haven't done the environmental assessment yet. But generally, what they've done with the last 10 sales or so that I've worked on, they log 60%. So as we kind of walk through in here, you can imagine 6 and 10 trees would be cut. Sometimes they'll have guidelines where they'll say we're not going to log any trees over 110 years of age, or, you know, for example, there's maybe a few nice grand firs, and they're like, we won't log any grand firs to maintain diversity or blah, blah, blah. So we don't really know that kind of stuff yet. So at this point, which is known as the scoping point, which is the very first stage of a timber sale, and usually with the scoping point, all you'll get is the map that tells you where the sale is, and a brief letter that says, we'd like to log here. Let us know your concerns. And they'll give you 30 days to write any general concerns you have. So that's kind of a good point, just kind of to get a feel for the area and just to kind of come up with just, you know, generic concerns that you might have with the timber sale. They say that they do leave snags. Often they do not. Most of the times they do not. There's the OSHA standards, the Occupational Safety and Hazard something, will require that a lot of these decadent snags, if they're logging around them, they will require them to be cut and knocked down because of safety hazards to loggers. So, but on the plus side, they create snags for us. They take dynamites and blow the tops of the trees. This does practically nothing. Snags are an old, dead, rotted tree. You know, to create a snag, you have a live tree. And they say it takes a tree just as long to live as it does to die. So 1,000-year-old tree, you know, lives for 1,000 years, takes 1,000 years, you know, it'll stand as a snag for say 500 years, then it'll fall in the ground and spend another 500 years rotting. But these snags go through a long, complicated process where a bacteria and a fungus will enter the tree and start to soften it up. And then like something like a woodpecker will come along and create little cavities, and those little cavities will allow other things to get in there to rot it out even further. And you know, snags provide, you know, so much habitat. That's the majority of the habitat are provided by snags. 1/3 of all critters in the forest depend on snags for a home. And most species are at risk in our forest because they don't have a place to live. So snags are extremely vital. So yeah, so it's kind of yes and no with snags. So we're still at the scoping stage with this sale. We're supposed to have the environmental assessment will come out this summer. I think they said May. And that, if you don't know, is like an 80 to 100 page document, and it just outlines all the reasons why it's going to be great to log here. And it'll usually have the reasons to log, and they'll have the no action alternative, which is what would happen if they didn't log. And then when they release the environmental assessment, you'll usually have a 30-day comment period on that, where you can write more specific comments based on their analysis and based on your on-the-ground observations and, you know, what doesn't mesh and whatnot. So we should have that out this summer. So we're here at a really good time because scoping comments often have a lot more weight than comments when the environmental assessment comes out. Just because they've, you know, when the environmental assessment comes out, they've done all this paperwork and they're pretty set in their ways. But when they're scoping, they're still trying to get a feel for the place. So later on in the day, we can, you know, express some of our concerns to them and you know, see what happens.
What are some stuff that we can look for to think about when we're going through this?
That's a really good question.
And how much time is left in the scoping?
Yeah.
Comment?
Well, yeah, there's no set date when it's supposed to come out. It just says summer of 2008.
So we can write comments?
Or summer 2007.
We can write comments on the scoping of this up until then?
They do have a period where it's like a 30-day scoping period where they want comments. But Randy Heron, is that right? We recently did a hike with a fellow from the BLM, and he had told us that he would, you know, accept comments on sales he's working on up to the environmental assessment. So it's still, we can still get comments to them. You know, later on in the process, it might get harder when they're, you know, already got the EA scoping, but they'll take them into consideration up to that point. And what to look for, maybe I'll just kind of address those things as we go.
Diversity. You don't need to know the names of the trees or the plants, but a simple look around, the different leaf structures or the different, it's just the different plants, start counting them in your mind, because that's a powerful thing. If you can say, you know, I counted 15 different species just standing in one spot, you know, that's a lot of, that's a diverse forest. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to remind the forest or the, whatever the agency is you're communicating with, that when they start cutting things down, they're making it harder for plant that diversity to exist, you know, for ferns to grow, because there's not a canopy making it shady for them, because ferns don't like full direct sunlight. If they cut down all of one type of tree, how is it going to come back? You know, you're going to start to see more monoculture happening within the tree species. But that's not something, you know, you don't need to know the different species to be able to count the different ones that are out here. I think that's a good thing to do.
I always like to look for habitat and just any kind of species that, you know, just maybe the plant species that you've never seen before. It's always good to, you know, document that. So it could be something rare, like a survey and managed species, or which is a very rare species that can sometimes halt a timber sale, or at least get them out here to look into it, to investigate it, to see if it is something special that should be preserved. So yeah, should we go check this place out?
I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I don't wanna rock the boat. I don't wanna rock the boat. I'm a question. I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I don't ask any questions. I don't want to make any waves. I don't want to rock the boat. I just want to collect my pay. I'm a true American. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a true American. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't care where my money comes from. I don't care who gets burned. I don't believe in unions. I get mine, I don't care about yours. I'm a true American, and I believe in baseball days. I'm a true American, and this country's so great. And I'm too busy to change. I'm too busy to change. I'm a true American, and the earth has got to pay. I need a seat deck in my backyard. I need to drive an SUV. I need 400 channels for comfort. I need the third world to bleed for me. I need plastic packaged poison food. I need a strong economy that's good. I need a gun that fires rapidly in case the UN comes looking for me.
There's some pooling that's starting up here. The culvert is rusted, so it'll probably break through eventually. And one way to sort of avoid some of that is to actually do a simulation in the culvert of the actual ground. So like they'll put rocks in there and try to cultivate some, you know, because when streams are going through, they're actually going through a filtration process, right? So, because there's all sorts of really great things in streams that keep streams from getting, you know, keep them clean. And so actually you can put that stuff in the culvert and it will help. It also can sometimes lead to blocking it, but if the culvert is big enough and you've got enough room to capture the bed of the stream, then it should actually sort of recreate itself inside of the culvert, which is really key for keeping a culvert clear eventually. Another thing that they probably should have done with this culvert is put some sort of rocks or some sort of thing around here to keep the soil from eroding into it, but we don't always do that.
So when they build these roads, there's no restrictions or laws that demand that they look into the future and take care of business?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think that they understand that the cost of these roads is huge. So, in fact, actually, you do see them taking it pretty seriously and trying to put the right resources into building the roads.
So they don't factor in all this other costs when when they sell the timber.
As you can see, that's a pretty well rotten snag, and it's got fire scars on it. So looking at some of these younger trees that are maybe like, you know, in the 60 to 80-year-old range, you know, do they have fire scars on them? And that can kind of give us an idea of when the fire came through. Because if these guys aren't scarred, then maybe that those fire scars are from like 100 years ago or something like that. So, you know, that's kind of what we're doing. We don't have an environmental assessment. We don't have answers to a lot of these questions. So we just kind of are speculating at this point.
But if we bring these up to them in the scoping phase, they will have to address them in the environmental impact statement.
Very good point. Yeah, at the scoping phase, when we send in comments to the Forest Service, supposedly they have to address any of our concerns. So this is a really good time to be raising those type of questions.
We're surrounded by logged land. Do they have to take the fact that it's surrounded by already logged lands into consideration?
Supposedly, you're supposed to do what's called cumulative impacts, which is looking at the land in general. And when you look at a map of this area, it's like the section or the town, you know, the little sections are like little square miles. And you look at one and it's BLM, private land, BLM, private land. And it does that throughout this area. So the private lands are pretty much all cut. And the BLM lands are, you know, a lot of them are like what we're looking at right now. So, yeah, for the cumulative impacts, these are vital, you know, because everything else around it's had the snot logged out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That somebody was asking about what should we be looking for. I would think that would be on top of the list. Sure. This area's already been hammered. So whoever asked that question then.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. It's a really good idea to take into consideration the surrounding landscape. you know, especially for watershed concerns, because, you know, the watershed can only take so much sedimentation. So if it's all logged, and, you know, there's going to be a lot more sedimentation if you're just logging little bits and pieces of it. And same for habitat. You know, if it's all logged, there's no habitat. So, you know, little pockets like this could be even more important when everything else around it's logged.
This is pretty special too. I mean, you don't see areas recovering so well sometimes from logging and plus having the cumulative impact. Some of those areas around Clear Dodger, it's like there's some good recovery happening, natural recovery, but there's some areas that are just, there's some invasive species coming in from the roadways. There's lots of crowding happening, and it's just not recovering as well. This is recovering very well.
You can see a lot. There's a lot of diversity here. I've counted like 4 different ferns that we've been through. There's salal that's starting to come up. There's blueberries coming up. There's a nice big fat clump of Oregon grape over there, which you should all know. It's our state flower. And what else? Yeah, so this is just really starting to take off through here.
Well, you're mentioning a lot of the plants, but also it would seem to me if you're logging all around us, then this is going to be a haven for whatever animal life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if they come in here and do this, then they're basically doing away with the biodiversity.
Yeah. I especially been coming out to these areas, and just the bird populations down here are just incredible, because so many birds that live up at higher elevations, when the winter comes, they come down in elevation. So a lot of these areas like this just get really concentrated, especially when you're seeing, you look through there and you can see clear cut. And you look through there and you can see that's all been cut. So little pockets like this are vital for little critters like that.
Does the BLM or land management agencies take that into account when they're doing environmental assessments, considering like if there's like a clear cut over there or over there, is this like a haven?
Usually, yes, they should. And usually what they do is they mention cumulative impacts and then they call that written. And a lot of times I think they just kind of are dismissive because they're like, well, that's private land and that's not our business or whatever. But it needs to be taken into consideration for forest health, and that's supposedly what they're managing for. So, yeah.
So you're saying they just consider it and go ahead and do what they want?
Yeah, usually you'll just see mention of it. Like, you know, in the environmental assessment it'll say surrounding lands have been logged extensively, and we're planning on logging these areas in the future, and that's the cumulative impacts. But it doesn't really address what is that, you know, what's 1 + 1, you know, it just lists what 1 and 1 is.
In the next 2 years, BARC is working on this campaign. At the moment, we're calling it the Management Plan Campaign. We'll hopefully have a better name for it soon. But in 2009, Mount Hood is due for a revision of their management plan. So for every action that the Forest Service takes, they check in, supposedly, with this management plan they have. And it's a very large document. It's a huge book. And it sort of is like the guidelines for how to take care of a forest. Right now, the one that they're working off of is about 12 years old, which means that there is science in there that is 12 years old, which means that it's very out of date. And so, essentially, they justify some of their logging projects based on science that has been definitely, you know, updated. And so in 2009, they're going to be writing a new management plan. And BARC saw this as a really great opportunity to have some pretty long-term impacts on the way that Mount Hood the Forest Service manages the national forest. So we have been starting to put together a coalition of people around the city and around this region. We've got Trout Unlimited, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Mazamas, which is a climbing club, Sierra Club, Oregon Wild, a great coalition of people. And basically what we want to do in the next 2 years is start to come up with sort of an alternative to this plan. What is our vision? What is the vision of people who actually use this forest, who depend on it for drinking water? You know, 1/3 of all Oregonians get their drinking water originating in Mount Hood. That's a really important thing to remember when you're talking to people about your experience out here today. Interestingly enough, the first part of this process, in a sense, is they are going to be redoing the travel plan, which is essentially a plan of, it's kind of the similar thing, but it's how to manage the road system in Mount Hood. And like I already mentioned, there's 4,000 miles of roads in Mount Hood, so it's quite a task to manage all of those roads. So BARC and the rest of this coalition is going to sort of begin our process of coming up with a citizens alternative for the management plan by doing our own roads plan. What do we think roads should be in Mount Hood which ones should be obliterated, which ones should stay because they lead to really important recreation areas. So for the next 6 months, we're actually starting out by inventorying all of the roads in Mount Hood, so that when we talk to the Forest Service and we talk to the public, we actually know what we're talking about. We have spent so much time in the forest, 10 years working in the forest, trying to stop logging projects. And we often look at the roads that are getting built as a result of the logging projects, but we haven't done a lot of data collection on roads in Mount Hood. So we decided the best way to start would be to just get as much data as possible so that we can really go in knowing what we're talking about and be site specific, which we've always found is the most powerful way to try to protect these areas. And so that's kind of the beginning stages of this much larger effort to start moving Mount Hood away from logging and towards low impact uses of the forest, such as some recreation opportunities. So how are we inventorying? Basically, we're going out, we've got a survey form that people fill out when they go to the roads that we're targeting to go. We're trying to hit about 10% of the roads in Mount Hood. And for every culvert or stream crossing that they get to, there's a separate survey form that people can fill out. It's very user-friendly. You don't have to know a lot about science or road maintenance or road building, or you don't have to work for ODOT because Joe already does that, and you don't have to work for all these, you don't have to know much about what you're doing. We can show you a lot of the stuff you need to know. We just basically need people going out there with their eyes and making note of what's happening. And then what we're doing is collecting all of that information and turning it into maps using GIS software, which I won't go into because it's kind of boring unless maybe you are into caching. What was it called? What is it called? Geocaching. Geocaching, yeah, that's so awesome. And then from there, we're going to start basically coming up with some recommendations to the Forest Service about how to make a road system that better reflects what we want out of the National Forest. So if people are interested in that, you can talk to me, or you can email me or call me.
Has these holly sharp like leaves. You'll get a cluster of yellow flowers in the top that'll be followed by blueberries in the late summer and fall. It's one of the most common understory plants in low elevations. The other two most common ones are this guy right here. And this is a sword fern. And it's the most common fern in our area. It's an evergreen fern, so it's up all winter. It doesn't die back each year or anything like that. And the other one we've got here is salal, which is right here. And you can see the salal's got kind of the heart-shaped leaves, and they're kind of alternate, and the stem kind of zigzags as it goes up the stem. They'll have these pink little flowers that all hang from one end at the very tip of the branch, and those are preceded by purple berries that some think are good and some don't think are good. Sometimes are good and sometimes aren't good. I'll say it as that. And while they're all growing together right here, these are really good indicator species because what you'll generally find is a lot of the sword ferns like to grow in wetter locations, and the Oregon grape is kind of in a medium dampness situation, and the slough is in a drier situation. So you can kind of use those as indicator species of what kind of moisture levels you might find in the soil. And as you can see by this pot right here, you know, it doesn't always work. Nature doesn't always abide by these nice little neat classifications we try to put it in.
Thank God. Then is that a huckleberry sometime?
Yeah. This is a huckleberry here. This is the red huckleberry. Not as tasty as the blue ones. A little more tart.
So this plant also useful? The
Oregon grape is probably the premier plant medicine in our area. You guys have probably all heard of golden seal. Like they've been putting it in cereals, and you know you're supposed to use it for everything. Everything. Well, Oregon grape has exact same chemical constituents. Well, it doesn't have the exact same, but it has nearly the same chemical constituency as golden seal, berberine, and hydrasticine. Golden seal is nearly extinct. There's some folks that are starting to farm it now, so if you do use it because your little book tells you to, buy organically grown golden seal because it's nearly gone. And better yet, well maybe not better yet, but you could also use Oregon grape. And Oregon grape is pretty easy to grow in the garden, and it's really abundant in our area. It can be used for, I think of it more as for the stomach and the liver. It stimulates your liver, so it creates bile, which is good to help food go through your system. And also on a stomach note, it's a bitter. So if you take it before you eat, it starts salivatory secretion, so it gets your saliva going, gets all your stomach secretions going, so that when you eat your food, it moves through your system quicker. And it takes up more of the nutrients and just makes a little less work for your liver as that's all going through. And on that same note, wait, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, it's also antibacterial, which means it can inhibit some forms of bacteria, and it seems to work primarily in the intestines. So in that same kind of digestive tract, this is key. People use it from all the way from like dysentery to giardia. This can work really wonderful for any kind of intestinal infections.
The root of the leaves.
I'm sorry?
Is it the root of the leaves?
Yeah, it's the root, or technically it's a rhizome. And if you kind of look down, and if you just kind of peel back a little bit of that bark, you see that golden yellow stuff? That's the good stuff. That's the stuff that you would want to use.
In the root.
In the root, yeah. This guy is just, it's technically a stem, but this stem will just trail through the earth. If I started tugging on this stem will just, you know, it might even be connected with those two guys up there. These rhizomes will just trail just, you know, just an inch below the surface of the soil. But yeah, anyways, anytime you're reading anything about golden seal, this plant is a wonderful adjunct for that and can be used wonderfully. more. This is the water treatment plant for the city of Corbett here. And I wanted to show you guys a few things. I don't think we're going to make it up to see it today. But if you guys still have your maps, I have. This is the Corbett Water District's drinking protection area with sensitive areas and potential contaminant sources. And I went through and highlighted the areas of land that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And here's section 11, which is barely on the map. And here's section 13. There's Lookout Mountain down on here. And you can see here are the intake valves. This little blue dot here and this little blue dot here. So what we have is there's the North Fork and there's the South Fork of the of Gordon Creek. And where we were at, they've already come together and it's just Gordon Creek. But these are the two intake valves that they have pipes that pipe the water about 1.5 miles down this road to this water treatment plant. The water comes down from those two sites and it enters into this plant. This plant uses, it's a slow sand filter, which all the water will come down and it's filtered through. It's a couple feet of sand sitting on top of a couple feet of gravel. And all the water just kind of slowly seeps down through that. And then it travels elsewhere where it's chlorinated, and then is there another process to it?
No, it just goes to the reservoir.
Okay, then it goes to the reservoir and stored there.
Some bicarbonate in there, sodium bicarbonate in there too.
Okay.
For hardness.
Okay. So at this place, it's just getting out like the major sediment and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The water comes down there, it enters this plant, it's filtered out. So what they have is this community of Corbett the community of Corbett's about 3,200 people that get their water from here. And they pull 900, on their peak demand is anywhere from 800 to 1,000 gallons per minute, which I just think is kind of crazy. It's 1/3 of a gallon per person. And they're permitted to pull 900 gallons from the North Fork or the South Fork. Oh, someone else has said. So, you know, sometimes during the peak demands, they might need 1,000 gallons per minute, so they would be required to pull from both the North and the South Fork. But for the most part, they will just use the North Fork, I believe, in the summertime, which is the area that's right in the middle of Unit 1. And then the South Fork, they'll pull from in the winter and the fall, which is just south of that. And I haven't got down there to see that due to illness. And so I'm not sure what the area like that looks like. But if we just kind of think back to that little microcosm we saw along the road and the sediment going into there, we could just imagine what it's almost, you know, it's right at the bottom of Unit 1 that the intake valve is. So it's pretty much a square mile from the intake valve would all be logged all around there. And all that water is going to end up in that one pipe. So that's a massive amount of sediment that would be coming down that pipe to this area. And the slow sand filtering process that they use here is really sensitive to sedimentation. In fact, in last November, when we got the heavy rains, we remember when it used to rain here. It's kind of raining today, but when it rains a lot, they actually had to shut down the plant for a while because it was blocked up with sediment. And then when they got that cleared out and they tried to run it at a slower pace, it just immediately clogged up again. So they've had problems just this last November. You know, what is logging going to do to exacerbate that? And especially when peak demand is beyond what one of those intake valves can pull from. There's going to be times when they're going to be required to pull from both of those.
So what does the city of Corbett think about this logging plan?
Well, we don't know yet. Again, we're at the scoping process. So they will have to meet with the community of Corbett to discuss the situation. So we'll find out probably during the environmental assessment. Yeah, but they are required to meet with someone from the board, the water board in Corbett, to discuss this for any logging. And there's a memorandum of understanding signed between the agencies and the community of Corbett that this watershed is to be used primarily for municipal water, because that's, you know, the most important thing in this area. And as we've also witnessed, you know, not only is this going to seriously impact their water source, you know, this lovely trail that we just hiked is an educational trail that they use to bring, you know, local kids out here to educate them. And that was all within the logging proposal as well.
So is the sediment in the water harmful to people, or is it just difficult to get out of the water?
Well, it's mostly that at this point it wouldn't let any water through because the sediment will clog up their filtering system. And so no water would be able to get through. Because when they had that storm event in November, It completely shut it down. And they had to put out some kind of conservation measure because they only have 30 hours worth of storage capacity.
Well, they had floods in February '96 that shut down the Salem water plant for a month.
Yeah.
They were hurting down there.
Yeah.
And it was same reason, logging,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And in fact, they do their water quality assessment, the Corbett Water District does, and they list 9 potential contaminant sources, and 4 of them deal with logging and the associated effects of logging. So yeah, it's what's that?
I said out of 9.
Yeah. So it's almost half of the reasons not to, that would have the most detrimental effects to the watershed or logging itself.
Do you know any other the other 5?
One is Larch Mountain. This is where the Gordon Creek starts, and one is like I guess they use some pesticides and fertilizers up there to keep it pretty or whatever. So they're worried that some of that will get in there. And there's a couple random dump sites that folks might dump a bunch of old paint or whatever. Another one's road building, which I guess obviously logging is going to do a lot of road building.
In a forest canyon, I thought to myself, this ain't the way we should treat our world. No, 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 no. In a forest canyon, I watch the eagles, so no place for them to land. The trees are all cut down, trees are all cut down and gone.
That first little triangle of trees is the very first unit we went to when we first came in. And then we were back, kind of tucked back over here to the right, was the second little spot where we stopped and had lunch. And well, now we're here. And you can kind of see the road. If you look straight ahead down the valley, you can see just the tail or the start of a road coming there. And that's the first road. Right, we went into the unit, and that's the road that kind of, if we would have continued on that road, it would have winded down and crossed Gordon Creek, and you can see it switching back up the mountain on the ridge side on the left-hand side.
So this is called forest management?
Yeah, yeah. And what I really think is spectacular is you can see this nice straight line between BLM land and private land. And you can tell the BLM unit there stands out, and again, where we were before, it stands out amongst these smaller trees right here. So a lot of times if you're ground truthing and you want to see units, it's just that damn easy. The trees that are healthy, that's what they want to log. So you can see here, obviously they're not going to log this. Here's nice trees, yeah, that's what they're going to go after.
The logging on the slip, is this BLM or private land?
Right where we're at now?
Yeah, the slope.
This is private land. This little chunk bit out right here is private land. And if you look on the map, you'll see that where there's the BLM land and then there's other land that's just white. It doesn't have any, like the green color is National Forest land, and the yellow stuff is BLM land, and all the white stuff is private land. And this is usually how private land's treated in this area.
Pretty much no regulation at all.
No, very little. I mean, especially, we're right here is Gordon Creek again.
Is this Weyerhaeuser?
What's that?
Is this Weyerhaeuser?
Frank Lumber?
Oh, yeah, that's what that said.
I think that's what that sign said, yeah. So this little parcel right here. But, it's just such a weird checkerboard pattern in this area of land management. It's probably different individuals owning different squares of property out here. So I wanted to bring you here. I showed you the point. I showed you on the map where there's the north and the south fork, and they kind of come together. If we went about a half mile that way, it's where those two would converge. And there's a point there where those two would converge to about where we are right now. And this area has experienced landslides in the past, primarily due to logging. In fact, in the watershed analysis, it said one of the major risks to Gordon Creek was logging on steep slopes directly adjacent to the stream, especially on the north side. So we're on the north side of Gordon Creek, where the slopes in this area have a gravelly loam type soil, which is really fragile to logging. So, I mean, again, to be fair, we'll have to see where they draw that line when they come out here and log. But if it's anywhere coming down these slopes, we have some serious problems with this. So, I thought this would be a great, captivating place that we could sit down and write our comments to the Bureau of Land Management, and we can just enjoy the view and speak from that.
And if you see me crying, you know that I'm a sad man. And if you see me crying, you know that I've had it long.
So what kind of weight do they give these comments? They just head to the waste paper basket.
What's that?
Or they just head to the waste paper basket?
Well, I hope not. Anytime, especially in the scoping phase, any comments that they receive, any points that are brought up should be addressed in their environmental analysis.
And will they respond to you personally?
Theoretically. I mean, they probably, you know, if each of us has the same question, they probably won't, you know, address it 21 times or whatever, but it should be addressed, yes.
In a forest canyon, I walk where the angels tread, only to find man's tread. Legacy of stumps, legacy of stumps and waste. In a forest canyon, I watch the eagles soar. In a forest canyon, no place for them to
So we're in where they're going to want to be cutting.
Correct.
Taking 60% of the trees.
Yeah, well, we don't know that for sure because the environmental
But that's
assessment
it.
isn't went out, but that has been the trend. Yeah.
So what is the purpose? I mean, these things, it's
Well, if you look around in the forest here, the predominant tree that you see in the area is hemlock. And hemlock is not one of the favored trees in the area because it's not as commercially viable. So my suspicion is they will come down and cut mainly the hemlock from this area so that the Doug fir that remain can grow big. And then that will be the marketable timber source in the near future.
so that's what they're saying. That's what's called a slow motion clear cut.
Correct.
Because they'll come back, cut the Doug fir in what,
Yeah.
10 or 20 years, or
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The theory is if you thin the trees, you get, they call it release, and that, you know, if you cut this tree, then that tree is all of a sudden just going to explode because it's not going to have the competition up there in the canopy. So, you know, it works for carrots. If your carrots are growing too close together and
Or
you pluck them out,
radishes.
the other ones get really big. But, you know, when I harvest my carrots, I usually don't walk around going like this around all the carrot plants too. So, you know, that is going to be, another huge factor with logging as well.
well, right. I mean, it opens it up to light, but it also compacts the ground, and it creates
Right.
conditions that aren't conducive to growth, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah, just the compaction of the soil. I mean, you know, we haven't even talked about all the critters that live in the soil and their vitality in keeping this forest healthy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all that's going to be impacted.
Emma, call me, we need you now. Emma, call me, we need you now. To make the masses, to make them aware. Wake
requires that they send out the scoping letter that says, yeah, we're probably going to log in this kind of area. So it's just, NEPA is just the National Environmental
Protection.
Sure.
Policy.
Policy. That's it. National Environmental Policy Act, and that just outlines the ways in which the process works. Yeah. So it's just the guidelines for the Forest Service and for the BLM to follow when they're doing a plan.
But it doesn't apply to private land.
No, no. They still have to apply with things like the Endangered Species Act and things like that, and Clean Water Act. But as you can, as we witnessed just a little bit ago, not that well, because yeah, that stream is not only a water source for a community, but it carries 5 different species of federally listed threatened species of fish. The BLM is presently, in next year, by 2008, they're supposed to revise their management plan for all of Western Oregon. And what they're trying to do is have these lands, the BLM lands that are non-contiguous, so they're just little piecemeals that go throughout Oregon, to have those no longer be mandated to be under the Northwest Forest Plan, to do things like survey and manage, to do pretty much all the good things they do to protect species in this area. Initially, when these stands were set aside, they were supposed to be for maximum timber production. And since they're no longer meeting those quota, they want to just basically bring it back to the old days. This process is further complicated by what they have is called the county payment plans, and this is especially prevalent down in southern Oregon. The city of Roseburg just shut down all their libraries. And what has happened is, the way that the federal governments have done this is that half of the revenue generated from timber sales was going back into the counties, and they were using this to fund public works. And they have since basically stopped doing that because logging has slowed down enough, so they're not generating the funds that they were once. So the government stepped in for a while and was supplementing the counties with those funds, but they're no longer doing that. It just expired last year, and that was the first thing I heard, was that Roseburg, was prioritizing, and they closed all the libraries. So now, when the environmental assessment comes out, and the Bureau of Land Management is going to be saying, like, well, this is what we'd like to do. We'd like to stop, having all these environmental protections on our lands and just start logging them. And so when folks in Roseburg and other places in southern Oregon are confronted with that, they're going to be like, okay, do I want my kids to go to school? Do I want to have a library? Or do I want to have forests? So it's some really kind of shabby political maneuvering going on. But this is going to be just right around the corner. There's going to be environmental assessment coming out on this. So yeah, I just wanted to have that kind of be in the radar, because that's going to be coming up real soon.